All right, so a couple years ago, I started a new organization, new environmental organization called the Wild Equity Institute. And if you follow environmental organizations at all, first thing that you should wonder is why? Why on earth there are so many environmental groups already? So many groups working to protect the environment, animals, everything else. Do we really need one more? And I have to say, I can't say for sure. I can't say for sure it's justified to have one more. But here's what I did know. I did know that the environmental movement, my entire career to date, the career of every environmental activist that came before me, to this point, total, abject failure. This is what I knew. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, wait a minute. Clean Air Act has made a big difference in local air pollution. This is true. Clean Water Act has made a big chunk of our nation's rivers fishable and swimmable, if not at the rate at which Congress. This is all true. We've had many very important, very hopeful battles that have been won throughout the environment. But at the largest scales, where the greatest, most systemic environmental injustice threats exist, things are getting worse. And even more disconcerting is you take the derivative of the movement, look at the rate of change, how quickly it's getting worse. It's getting worse at a faster rate than ever before. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the amount of inequity across our human communities, the number of species on the brink of extinction, all of these are getting worse despite so much effort, care, and passion have been going into it. And the question was, why? How could this be? What can we do to change that? I thought to myself, we need to figure out a way to make the movement bigger, scale it up, so that it's proportionate to the threats we face. We can get better at the same time. This was the idea. So I came up with this idea of starting a new group called the Wild Equity Institute, and the word equity was purposefully chosen as part of the name because as I was bopping around in my career, I started out, as Manoj mentioned, doing this joint degree program with the Kennedy School of Government out at Harvard and the law school at Berkeley. I don't know why this is the case, but the Kennedy School loves joint degree programs. They have, if you just call them up and say you're interested in starting a joint, there's a high probability that they're going to agree to do that with your institution. They got one with all of them, including Bolt, which is all the way on the other side of the school, and Bolt has its own very prominent and well-qualified public policy school. They could just as easily have a joint degree program right down. And Harvard Law School, that's no joke either. But they have one with Berkeley nonetheless. So I was doing this program, and when I graduated, a friend of mine who was a 3L when I was a 1L hung a shingle, started his own law practice, and it turned out gratefully that he was brilliant. He was very good at what he did, and he made his law practice into a very successful regional office of this nonprofit group called the Center for Biological Diversity. During that time period that he was getting started, I was just helping him out, essentially volunteering for his organization, and eventually tried to make myself indispensable so that if I threatened to leave, they'd be kind of forced to offer me a job. And throughout my career, the experiences I've gained watching different organizations function, considering the moral foundation, the theory of change of their work, I found that getting involved and volunteering and becoming indispensable has been the key to getting almost every job I've ever had, including my job now at San Francisco State. Had a law professor at UC Davis call me up one day who was working on frogs and said he needed some help protecting some of these species. We filed a case. He was my expert, and a couple years later he called me up and said, why don't you come teach for me now? So, as I was working through all this stuff, I got some experience doing grassroots conservation work, and it struck me that there was really an ethical basis for most of the work. The laws are all based on best available science. Most environmental laws are. But the rationale, the power, the belief that drove the advocates was really based here in their heart, not so much what was in their minds, what they knew. They felt some moral obligation to these plants and animals that are on the brink of extinction. After a few years of doing that, I worked there for about 6 years, I started working on some environmental justice cases, which was also a deep, profound interest to me. Had a series of environmental justice clients where this word equity is used much more frequently. The inequitable distribution of environmental bads across our communities based on factors that have no relevance at all. Race, income. It's a word that is used frequently in those movements, but never used in the context of this other arm of the environmental movement, the conservation movement. In some ways, there's a lot of tension between the two, but as I was bopping back and forth and trying to understand why one person could care so much about these two different movements, despite the fact that there seemed to be some tension across the two, it sort of came to me that it's really all one. It's just some concern about some inequitable relationship, a gap between what we know, how we know we ought to behave, how we ought to treat each other or treat other things, and how we actually act. The gap between what we know is right and what we actually do, attacking that gap. Both movements were doing that. It's just that the gap that they were focused on ultimately owed some moral obligation to something quite different. Now, environmentalists, conservation environmentalists anyways, they don't use the word equity because they're so focused on these inter-species concerns between people and everything else, right? That it just doesn't even factor into their language, even though, from my perspective, that was precisely what they were doing, and trying to build back a more equitable, and I'm not saying equal. I'm not suggesting that we owe the same moral obligations to the environment, to any animal species as we owe to each other, but we owe it something. Right? They don't use it because that word isn't used frequently in that context. The EJ movement, the justice movements that I've been involved with, they use that word frequently, but they're so focused on these intra-species concerns that it is just sort of outside their field of view to think about using that term to other things, the land, a system. And yet I felt like there was something there that perhaps, if we could show there was a moral foundation shared across these movements, that we could build a bigger, better, stronger movement from that basis. And so the Wild Equity Institute tries to work on campaigns that highlight the interconnected nature of these movements. I'm going to just give you a couple of examples of this. One of our examples we're working on back home in San Francisco is, it turns out, the city and county of San Francisco owns a public park in a different city called Pacifica, just south of San Francisco, about 15 miles on the coast. They've been operating it as a golf course for decades. But the golf course, like many golf courses these days, the golf market is struggling, is losing money hand over fist. $100,000 to $300,000 of general fund subsidy every year because the golf market's collapsing. The golf course has a series of constraints. One of the constraints is an environmental constraint. The operations and management of the golf course is killing 2 endangered species. One of them is called the California red-legged frog. This one's, some people call it Twain's frog. It's the central character of Mark Twain's short story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. Maybe some of you have read that story. And the other one, which is critically imperiled, very rare, probably the next vertebrate species to go extinct on the San Francisco Peninsula, it's called the San Francisco garter snake. So we found out about this campaign where the operations were killing these endangered species while at the same time draining general fund money from the coffers of San Francisco, while the city, trying to balance its budget like every other government it seems these days, is broke, was cutting services to neighborhood parks, community centers, social services. And so we brought a campaign together between a lot of groups that just didn't really work together before. Folks work us on providing services to the poor, the needy in the city, these conservation organizations down in San Mateo County. We've brought them together in a single campaign to think about transferring this land to the National Park Service, which already owns the adjacent property, manage it as a new national park, and then San Francisco, with the money it saves, they can axe all that red off of their books. They can reinvest that in whatever we desire. Neighborhood parks, community centers, social services, et cetera, et cetera. That's one of the things we do to try to bring groups together, be successful. And this has been a big fight. You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised how just occupying the status quo provides you with power. And it turns out golfers tend to have quite a lot of money and pretty good political connections. But we've been able to build a pretty good grassroots campaign, and we do whatever it takes to win. I'm a very competitive guy. I can't stand to lose. I hate it. I got that from my dad. My dad's 76 years old now. He plays handball, not the Olympic sport handball, but the one where if you're too tough to use rackets, but it's otherwise just like racquetball. And he is my dad is the national doubles champion for the 75-year and older category, 2 years running. He's a very, very good handball player, very competitive guy. But this past year, I call him up after the tournament. I was like, "How you doing?" He's like, I came in second. I can't stand it. I can't stand myself right now." I'm like, whoa, we're very much alike after all, aren't we? Because I can't stand, I don't even like winning that much, to be honest with you. Like winning, it's like I win, it's like great, let's move on to the next thing. But losing drives me crazy. So go Bears, man, go Bears. But this campaign's been going back and forth. We've made some great strides. We got legislation passed twice at the Board of Supervisors to rethink this national park. We've got a lawsuit going on. We do media work. We do education. We do whatever it takes to win in our tactics. Another campaign, very quickly. Several years ago, I was involved in some campaigns on the periphery, some environmental justice campaigns in San Francisco to help close some heavily polluting coal-fired power plants, mostly used as peaker plants in some of San Francisco's most disadvantaged communities, the southeast part of the city. And those were successful. But then to recoup the power that was lost when these power plants were closed, the Energy Commission, PG&E, some of these major power providers started to look for new places to build power plants, and they focused on another disadvantaged community in eastern Contra Costa County, out along the Delta, Antioch, Pittsburgh, Oakley. And they have approved the construction and operation, some of them are already built, of 5 power plants, all in this one area within 1 mile of each other, each of which are going to be state-of-the-art natural gas-fired power plants. So each one will emit fewer pollutants than any one of the power plants we close in the city. But collectively, massive amounts of pollution are going to be emitted. And there was a campaign out there based on human health impacts with some of my friends at the Communities for a Better Environment that was struggling to prevent these power plants from being built. But they all got approved nonetheless. At the same time, it turns out the power plants they all ring this little pocket wildlife refuge called the Antioch Dunes National Wildlife Refuge. It's a very unique, interesting wildlife refuge. The only wildlife refuge ever established specifically for insects. Most wildlife refuges are centered around bird conservation or some other manner, but this one had a very high rate of insect diversity, including this guy. This is the Lang's metalmark butterfly, and this is very likely to be the next butterfly, or maybe the next after the next butterfly, to go extinct in the United States unless we do something about it. Also impacted by pollution. The host plant for this butterfly requires sandy, nutrient-poor soils. But as we set things on fire, it turns out, among the things we emit is different kinds of nitrogen compounds. Some of those nitrogen compounds deposit into soils as part of the nitrogen cycle, which essentially acts as fertilizer. Nitrogen is one of the key components of most fertilizers. As that happens, invasive weeds, which otherwise could not grow in this native habitat, start to invade as the chemical composition of the soil is changed right from under the butterfly, crowding out the host plant. And no host plant, no butterfly. Last count, 28 of these guys in the wild. 28 left. 5 power plants now ringing it, 2 of which are going to be brand new, haven't even been constructed yet, 3rd one under construction. So we brought these 2 groups together to start a campaign, these lepidopterists, these butterfly specialists, and these human health guys together to bring a combination of Clean Air Act and Endangered Species Act claims together as one suit. And the way these lawsuits work under most environmental and many civil rights laws is before you go to court, they make you file a 60-day notice of intent to sue. The theory is you write them, you call them up, you say, hey, listen, we got a problem, let's talk, try to avoid litigation. Most of the time, in my practice, when we file these 60-day notices, you never hear from anybody ever again. Worst case scenario, you get some big shot lawyer calling you up and saying, do you know who I am? Do you know who you're messing with? I'm going to destroy you and everybody you love and anybody who ever shook your hand in a friendly way. Now, for me, I'm a competitive guy. When people say that to me, I'm like, bring it on. But they try to intimidate. This was different for some reason. The only thing that I can think of as different is that we brought these groups together to sort of rock their world. Their expectations of what sort of power we might have were rocked a little bit. As soon as we sent these in, every single one of these power plant owners, operators, called us up and said, hey, let's talk and see if we can reach some resolution. So we're in the process of working on that right now.